recognized by the court.
Now let's get to I like to go to like the TikTok. You know, the fad now is everybody want to set up a trust.
That's right. Yep.
So what actually is a trust, and how does that differ from a will?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's definitely a fad. I've seen a lot of that, and we field a lot of questions about that. And the thing is, a trust is a great tool. I have drafted hundreds, if not thousands, of trusts, and I think they're really important in certain situations. Not everyone needs a trust. Everyone needs a will.
Okay.
Some people also need a trust. So a trust can do many things, and there are as many family situations that you have. There are an equal number of trusts. So the great thing about it is it can be really customizable. So it can really reflect your family's dynamics, your family's values, what you want for your children or your spouse after you're gone. It can help with tax planning, things like that. But the most common thing that the TikTok trend, I think that you're referring to, that we see is that people want to use it to avoid probate.
Okay.
And that's a really popular reason for using a trust. It's a perfectly fine reason. Here in Alabama, we have a much more favorable probate process than they have in a lot of states. It's not particularly difficult. It is not particularly expensive or time consuming. Certainly can be, like you said, when something's contested. But it's a pretty straightforward process. And a lot of times, the cost of implementing a trust to avoid that process is going to exceed the savings on the back end. Again, why it's very important to talk to an attorney about that specific situation, because there are times that I go, absolutely, we need a trust. And sometimes the client comes in and says, you know, I think I need a trust. So-and-so down the street got one, or I saw it on TikTok. And we can kind of talk through and say, well, what are your goals? You know, why do you think that this is best for you? And then what is the actual best way for us to accomplish that? Okay,
and then, like you said, a lot of times people see a trust. Is it more favorable for people who have like multiple properties or businesses other than just individuals with the trust?
It certainly can be. I would say the most often use that we have for it is if there are minor children involved, because you want to make sure that those children are provided for and that there's not money being held up in a conservatorship or held up in the court for whatever reason, and that then they don't get a big check for that amount of money as soon as they turn 19, and they may not really be ready to manage that amount of money. So minor children is probably the most common usage that we have. But certainly if there are multiple properties, if you have multiple businesses, then you may want a trust, you may want a series of trusts. We may need to set up an LLC for some of this. It just sort of depends on the particulars.
Now, there are other things I've heard people do, like POD on the bank accounts, or they do quit claim the property. But sometimes I see from my personal experience that can get reversed to everybody. Depends on what state that person's in towards the end of their life. So I guess, and how long you been practicing here in Alabama?
Almost 20 years.
20 years. So any stories, situations, from, I don't call it battlefield, but just from the courtroom you've had to...
Oh yeah, I've got plenty. I could tell stories all day probably, but to address kind of the POD, quitclaim deeds, POD stands for payable on death, of course, and it can be a really useful tool, but it's not always the best tool, and I certainly wouldn't want that to be applicable to all of your accounts and all of your assets. Again, why it's really important to talk through each individual asset and make sure that they're addressed in the proper way. Again, talking about minor children, when we have PODs to a minor child, they can't actually receive that. And so it has to go through the court, causes a lot of problems. Quitclaim deeds, don't do this. This is not a great estate planning tool, right? Adding someone to your bank account as a co-owner, signing your property over to someone. Unfortunately, we see a lot of situations, talking about battlefield stories, where someone says, well, I went ahead and quitclaimed my property to my son, and now I want to sell it. Well, you can't do that. When you quit claim your property, that is a deed. You are transferring ownership. You do not have any ownership interest or any say over it. Your son can then sell that property out from under you. He can mortgage that property. He can refuse to pay the taxes on it and kind of leave you high and dry. There are just countless examples of the ways that can go wrong. So I strongly advise against that. We see a lot of those, these sorts of homemade deeds and
homemade, got off the internet.
That's right. That's right. And it's very rarely a good situation. We also run into issues with that when somebody then needs to go into a nursing home. So maybe they did that a couple of years ago. Now they need to go into a nursing home. We're applying for Medicaid, and Medicaid is going, wait. You gave your house away. So we're going to count that as an asset for their calculation purposes. And that's really, can be really harmful and really problematic to those folks.
Download the What's Happening Birmingham app today on Android, iPhone, and iPad for free. Get info on everything you need to know about local news, events, businesses, restaurants, and more. Visit our website, what'shappeningbham.com, or follow us on social media @happeningbham for more information. Download the What's Happening Birmingham app today, your source for everything Birmingham.